The boy was 9 years old when he watched his father walk out of the house for the last time. No argument, no dramatic farewell, just the sound of boots on the wooden floor of their Montreal home, the click of the latch, and then silence. The kind of silence that fills a room so completely you start to wonder if the person was ever really there at all. His mother stood at the kitchen window for a long time after that. She didn't cry. Not then. She just watched the empty street. And Callum Fraser, small, quiet, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn jaw, watched her. That image never left him. A woman standing at a window, waiting for something that was never going to come back. What happened next to Callum Fraser is the kind of story that makes you question everything you think you know about second chances. About what it means to be too late. About whether a person can be so far gone that even God would look the other way. He wasn't a saint. He wasn't particularly gifted. He grew up in the working-class parishes of East Montreal in the early 20th century. One of 5 children in a household where money was always tight and faith was something you performed on Sunday mornings and then folded away like a good shirt. His mother was a practical woman, not a warm one. She loved her children the way people love a responsibility, reliably, but without much softness. After his father left, she took in sewing. Callum took in bitterness. He was 15 when he first got into serious trouble. Nothing that made the papers. A stolen case of liquor from a warehouse near the docks. A fistfight that left another boy with a broken nose. A summer spent in a reformatory outside the city. When he came back, he was taller and harder, and the neighborhood recognized something in him that it recognized in a lot of boys like him. The particular emptiness of someone who had decided, very early, that the world owed him and intended to collect. His mother met him at the door when he came home from the reformatory. She looked at him for a long time, the way she used to look at the empty street, and then she said, quietly, "I have prayed for you every single day." He didn't answer her. He walked past her into the kitchen and made himself a cup of tea. He spent the next decade doing what men like him did in Montreal in those years. He worked on and off at the docks. He drank steadily, not dramatically. The slow, grinding kind of drinking that doesn't make scenes but quietly hollows a person out from the inside. He had relationships that ended badly. He moved from room to room in boarding houses that smelled of boiled cabbage and cigarette smoke. He was not unhappy in any obvious way. He was simply absent from his own life, from the lives of the people who might have loved him, from anything that could be called a purpose. The war came. He enlisted, not out of patriotism, but because there was nothing else to do and the army paid. He served in Europe, North Africa first, then Italy, and saw things that we will not describe here, because this is not a story about violence, and because the men who lived through those years rarely talked about them anyway. What we will say is that Callum Fraser came back from the war at 32 years old, thinner than he'd left, with a tremor in his left hand that never entirely went away, and a silence around him that was different from the silence he'd had before. Deeper, less defiant. He came back to Montreal. His mother was still alive, still taking in sewing. He visited her on Sunday mornings, not because of faith, but because the habit was still there, somewhere, like a groove worn into wood. She never asked him about the war. He never told her. They drank tea together and talked about small things, and it was, somehow, enough. He was 38 when he hit bottom. It's a strange phrase, hitting bottom. It implies a single moment, a dramatic impact. For Callum, it was more like arriving somewhere he'd been heading for a very long time and finally running out of road. He had lost a job, not the first, not the last. He had spent what little money he had in a bar on Rue Saint-Denis over the course of 3 days. On the 4th morning, he woke up on the floor of his room, with no money, no food, and a pain in his chest that he would later realize was his body beginning to give out on him. He lay on that floor for a long time, staring at the water stain on the ceiling, and he had the most honest thought he'd had in years. He thought, I have nothing to show for any of it. Not a family, not a home, and not a single person whose life was genuinely better because he had been in it. 38 years and nothing to show. He didn't weep. He wasn't the weeping type. But something cracked open in him that morning, quiet and irreversible, the way ice cracks in March. You don't see it happen, but suddenly the thing that was solid is moving. He went to his mother's house. He knocked on the door, and when she opened it, he said, and these are almost the exact words she would later write in a letter to her sister in Quebec City. I don't know what to do. She let him in. She made tea. And then she told him something she had never told him directly before. She said that she had been praying for him for 30 years. That she had prayed for him in the reformatory, and in the war, and in every rooming house she'd imagined him lying in. She said she believed God was not finished with him. He didn't believe her, but he was too tired not to listen. A neighbor, a woman named Irene, who attended a small Presbyterian congregation near the waterfront, had been trying to get his mother to attend a series of meetings held by a visiting speaker. The speaker was a missionary, she said, recently returned from decades abroad. An old man now, but remarkable. The kind of person who could explain faith in a way that didn't make you feel foolish for asking questions. His mother asked Callum to come with her. He went, not because he wanted to, because he had nowhere else to be, and because the look on his mother's face when she asked him was the same look she'd had at the kitchen window all those years ago, and he found he could not say no to it. The meeting was held in a church hall that smelled of old wood and candle wax. There were perhaps 40 people there. The speaker was in his 70s, a compact, white-haired Scotsman named Alistair Drummond, who had spent 35 years in West Africa and whose hands were the hands of someone who had done hard work for a very long time. He did not preach the way Callum expected. He didn't thunder. He didn't perform. He told stories. He talked about a man he had known in the Gold Coast, a man who had spent the first 50 years of his life believing he was beyond saving, and who had spent the last 30 of his life proving that the first 50 were simply the preparation. He talked about what it meant to surrender, not the weak, defeated kind of surrender, but the specific, deliberate act of putting down something you've been carrying so long you've forgotten your hands were ever empty. Callum sat in a wooden chair in that church hall and felt something he had not felt since he was 9 years old, standing in the hallway listening to his mother's silence. He felt seen. He didn't go forward. He didn't weep. He simply sat there, and when the meeting was over and his mother asked him how he felt, he said, I think I need to come back tomorrow. He came back the next night, and the night after that. On the fourth night, alone in his room, no dramatic setting, no choir, no moment of cinema, he got down on his knees on the wooden floor and told God, simply and without ornament, that he was done trying to do it himself, that if God wanted what was left of him, he could have it, that he wasn't sure he believed any of this, but that he was willing to try. He was 38 years old. He did not become a different person overnight, and the tremor in his hand didn't go away, and he still found social occasions difficult. He still woke sometimes at 3 in the morning with the cold sweat of years he couldn't entirely leave behind. But something had shifted, some fundamental orientation, like a compass finding north after years of spinning. He found his way to a small mission church on the edge of downtown Montreal. He started helping out, practical things at first, since he was a practical man, fixing things, moving furniture, the kind of unglamorous work that keeps a building from falling apart and that nobody photographs. The congregation was a mixed group, immigrants, working men, a few elderly women, Some people whose lives had taken the same kinds of turns his had. He felt at home among them in a way he hadn't felt at home anywhere since childhood. The pastor, a quiet Haitian-Canadian man named Edouard, I'd noticed something in Callum that Callum hadn't noticed in himself. He asked him one Sunday after the service if he'd ever considered working with men coming out of the prison system. Callum laughed. It was a short laugh, a surprised one. "I think I might know the territory," he said. He did. He began visiting the Bordeaux prison on the north end of the island, first informally, then as part of an organized chaplaincy program. He was not eloquent. He did not have a seminary degree or a polished testimony or a set of carefully constructed talking points. What he had was a face that men in difficult circumstances recognized. The face of someone who had been there, who was not performing sympathy, who was not going to flinch. He talked to them the way he wished someone had talked to him. He said, "I know what it looks like from where you're sitting. I know what it feels like to believe the story of your life is already written. I know the weight of deciding it doesn't matter anymore." And then he said, "I was wrong about that. And I am here in front of you to tell you that I was wrong." The work was slow. The work was by any conventional measure not spectacular. There were no stadiums, no headlines. Some men he spoke to were changed and some were not. And even the ones who were changed had hard roads ahead of them, and sometimes they fell, and sometimes they didn't get up. This is the thing about this kind of ministry that the stories often leave out. It is grinding, unglamorous, repetitive work, and you do it because you believe it matters, not because it feels triumphant. But Callum Fraser kept doing it. He was 45 when a correctional officer named Beozalil, who had watched him work for several years, connected him with a woman running a residential program for newly released prisoners in the east end of the city. Her name was Marguerite Trepanier, and she was a small, fierce woman in her 50s who had been running the program on almost nothing for years. She had the infrastructure. He had the relationships. They began working together. Within 3 years, the program had expanded from a single house to 4. It wasn't glamorous. It smelled like industrial cleaning fluid, and burnt coffee, and sometimes like desperation. The men who came through were not easy. Some of them stole from the house. Some of them relapsed. Some of them disappeared. But some of them didn't. Some of them found work, found housing, found their way back to the children they had left behind or who had been taken from them. Some of them, eventually, started doing the same work themselves. That's a tough artists. Not from the top down. Sideways, person to person. One man who has been through it talking to another man who is in the middle of it, passing something on. Callum Fraser never married. He sometimes wondered about this, in a reflective but not anguished way. He had had relationships in his earlier years, but by the time he had anything real to offer, the life he was living didn't leave much room. He lived simply, in a small apartment, not far from the mission church, and found he didn't want for much. The tremor in his left hand never went away. He drank tea in quantities that would have alarmed a physician. He read widely, history, theology, the occasional novel, and developed, late in life, a passion for bird-watching that he himself found slightly embarrassing. He kept going to Bordeaux long after most men his age would have stopped. He kept going when it was cold. He kept going when it was discouraging. He kept going when men he had spent years walking alongside made choices that broke his heart. He was 61 when a young researcher named Sophie Lacombe, working on a provincial study of recidivism among male offenders in Quebec, began tracking the outcomes of men who had come through the program. She spent 2 years not collecting data, interviewing former participants, following up with families and employers and social workers. What she found and what she published to some attention, in a report that eventually made its way to the desks of people in the provincial correctional system was that men who had spent significant time in the program were returning to prison at less than half the rate of the general population of released offenders. At half the rate. Callum read the report in his apartment. He put it down. He picked up his tea. He sat for a long time. He had never thought in terms of numbers. He thought in terms of faces. The specific, individual faces of men he had sat across from in concrete rooms. Men whose names he knew. Whose children's names he knew. Whose fears he had listened to over years of visiting. He had never been trying to solve a system. He had been trying to talk to a person. But the faces added up. The program had, by that point, worked with over 2,000 men across 3 decades. If half the rate of reoffending holds, and the research suggested it did, then the arithmetic becomes startling. The families who remained intact. The children who did not grow up watching their fathers go back to prison. The victims who were not victimized again. The ripple that moves outward from a single decision made in a small room in the East End of Montreal by a man who had never planned to do any of this. Sophie Lacombe asked him, in an interview, what he thought was the reason for the outcomes. She expected him to talk about program design, about structure, about evidence-based practice. She had her research categories ready. He thought about it for a moment. He said, "I think it's because the men know they're being seen. Not managed, not processed, seen." She wrote it down. It ended up as the epigraph of her report. He kept working. He was 67, then 70. Marguerite had long since retired. The program had a staff now, proper funding, a waiting list. He was technically an advisor, which meant he continued to show up exactly as he always had, just without a formal title. He still went to